Summer, 1943. Somewhere in Japanese-occupied Sumatra, the sun hammers down on a dirt road lined with barbed wire and wooden watchtowers. A column of women moves slowly in the heat. Nurses, teachers, missionaries, their clothing torn, their skin darkened by months of captivity. They are prisoners of war, Allied, British, Australian, Dutch. Their eyes are hollow, their steps mechanical. A guard barks an order in Japanese. The column halts near the edge of a military compound. Through the fence, the women see something they do not expect: a parade ground. Rows of young Japanese recruits standing at attention. And at the front, facing them with a pointer in hand, a woman. She wears a crisp khaki uniform. Her voice cuts through the air with authority. She's teaching them how to fight. The prisoners stare. Some squint in disbelief. Others feel something sharp, a nameless twist inside them. Confusion, anger, maybe envy. In that moment, the war shifts in their minds. The enemy is no longer just men with rifles. The enemy includes her. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Pacific War exploded across an ocean. Within weeks, Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia like a tidal wave. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Manila collapsed in early January. Singapore, Britain's so-called impregnable fortress, surrendered on February 15, 1942. The Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, crumbled by March. In the chaos, thousands of Allied personnel were trapped. Among them were women, nurses stationed at field hospitals, Red Cross workers, missionaries, teachers, plantation wives, government employees. They had been told the Japanese would never reach them. They had been wrong. The captures began in hospitals overrun by enemy troops. In Manila, American and Filipino nurses were seized at Sternberg Hospital and Santa Scholastica College. In Singapore, British and Australian nurses were taken from Alexandra Hospital, some still covered in the blood of patients they had been tending moments before. In Java and Sumatra, Dutch and British women were rounded up from colonial estates and internment centers hastily organized by the invading forces. These women became prisoners of war, though most were classified as civilian internees under international law. The distinction mattered little. They were herded into camps, surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by soldiers with bayonets, and subjected to the same deprivations as male POWs: inadequate food, forced labor, tropical disease, and the constant threat of violence. The camps were scattered across the occupied territories. Changi Prison in Singapore, Santo Tomas in Manila, Jideng and Kramit in Java, Palembang in Sumatra. Conditions varied, but the pattern was the same: overcrowding, malnutrition, dysentery, malaria. Women who had once lived comfortable colonial lives now slept on concrete floors, shared filthy latrines, and survived on bowls of watery rice. But survival demanded more than physical endurance. It required psychological resilience. The women formed tight-knit communities. They organized secret schools for children. They sang to keep morale up. They traded scraps of fabric and smuggled medicine. They clung to the belief that liberation would come. Yet liberation felt impossibly distant. The war dragged on. 1940 to became 1943. The Japanese controlled everything: the food supply, the work details, the flow of information. The prisoners had no idea if the Allies were winning or losing. They only knew that each day was a test of will, while Allied women languished behind barbed wire. A different reality existed on the other side of the fence. Japan had mobilized its entire society for total war, and that mobilization included women. Since the late 1930s, the Japanese government had systematically integrated women into the war effort. They worked in munitions factories, operated communications equipment, served as nurses in military hospitals, and staffed administrative offices across the empire. By 1943, hundreds of thousands of Japanese women were performing roles that directly supported the Imperial Army and Navy. Some went further. Women were recruited into auxiliary military organizations. The most prominent was the Women's Volunteer Corps. known in Japanese as the Joshi Taishintai. These women received basic military training. They learned discipline, drills, and in some cases, rudimentary combat skills. They were taught to handle bamboo spears, to throw grenades, to prepare for the defense of the homeland if invasion came. Others became instructors. In occupied territories across Asia, the Japanese military established training schools for local recruits and collaborators. Women were sometimes assigned as teachers in these institutions. They taught physical education, first aid, ideological indoctrination, and Japanese language. They wore uniforms. They carried authority. They embodied the idea that women could serve the empire just as mothers and factory workers, but as active participants in military culture. This was not entirely new in Japanese history. The samurai tradition had included onobu geisha, female warriors trained in martial arts, but the modern militarization of women was unprecedented in scale and ideology. It was driven by necessity, propaganda, and a belief in collective sacrifice. For the Japanese women involved, service was often a source of pride. They saw themselves as essential to victory. They believed in the mission of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, the propaganda vision of liberating Asia from Western colonialism. They did not view themselves as oppressed. They viewed themselves as empowered. This created a stark contrast. In the West, women had also entered the workforce and military support roles during the war, but public perception remained cautious. Women in uniform were often seen as temporary exceptions, not permanent fixtures. The idea of women teaching military tactics or drilling recruits was still controversial in many Allied nations. So when Allied female prisoners saw Japanese women in uniform, standing on parade grounds, commanding respect, instructing soldiers, it shattered assumptions. It was not supposed to look like that. The enemy was supposed to be backward, oppressive, cruel. Yet here were women who appeared confident, capable, integrated into a system that valued their contribution. The prisoners did not yet understand the full picture. They did not know about the coercion, the propaganda, the brutal realities Japanese women also faced. They only saw what was visible through the fence, and what they saw unsettled them deeply. The female prisoners came from vastly different backgrounds, but captivity erased those distinctions. Australian nurses who had trained in Melbourne hospitals now shared cramped barracks with British schoolteachers from Singapore and Dutch plantation wives from Java. American Red Cross workers slept beside Filipino civilians. Age ranged from teenagers to women in their 60s. Most had been captured in the early months of 1942. Some had witnessed combat. Vivian Bullwinkle, an Australian nurse, survived the Banker Island massacre in February 1942, where Japanese soldiers machine-gunned dozens of nurses on a beach. She played dead in the surf, then spent 3 years in camps. Others, like the American nurses seized in the Philippines, had been caring for wounded soldiers when enemy troops stormed through hospital corridors. In the camps, these women faced relentless hardship. Rations dropped below subsistence levels. A typical daily meal consisted of a small cup of rice, sometimes supplemented with watery vegetable soup or a sliver of dried fish. Protein was almost non-existent. Women lost dramatic amounts of weight. Beriberi, a disease caused by vitamin deficiency, caused swelling and paralysis. Malaria swept through barracks in waves, yet they resisted in small, crucial ways. They organized clandestine classes for imprisoned children. They staged secret theatrical performances. They smuggled medicine and news. They formed tight bonds that became lifelines. Survival was collective. No one made it alone. The first time the prisoners saw Japanese women in military roles, many assumed they were mistaken. Perhaps they were nurses. Perhaps they were clerical workers. But when the prisoners saw these women drilling recruits, teaching formations, carrying themselves with the posture of authority, the realization hit hard. One British nurse interned near Palembang, the moment in her diary. She wrote that it felt like watching a mirror image from a parallel world. In her own country, women had joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service and the Women's Royal Naval Service, but those roles were support positions. Seeing enemy women as instructors, as figures of martial discipline, felt alien. For some prisoners, it sparked anger. They had been told they were fighting for civilization, for freedom, for the values that elevated women. Yet here were women on the other side, visibly integrated, visibly confident. The propaganda did not match the reality. For others, it stirred something closer to confusion or even reluctant admiration. These women were not prisoners. They were not starving. They wore clean uniforms. They had purpose. The contrast was unbearable. The shock ran deeper than visual surprise. It touched fundamental assumptions about gender, civilization, and war itself. Allied propaganda had painted the Japanese as backwards, barbaric, a society that subjugated women. Yet the evidence before the prisoners suggested something more complex. In Japan, women's wartime mobilization was framed as patriotic duty, not oppression. The government promoted the idea of good wife, wise mother, but redefined it to include service to the state. Women were told they could honor their families by supporting the military. This ideology blended traditional values with modern militarism in ways Western observers found difficult to categorize. The prisoners, many raised in colonial societies with rigid class and gender hierarchies, suddenly confronted an uncomfortable question. Were they truly more liberated than the women they saw through the fence? Many Allied women had been discouraged from careers, expected to marry, confined to domestic roles. The war had opened doors, but those doors were meant to close again when peace returned. Japanese women in uniform represented something the prisoners could not easily process. They were the enemy, but they also occupied a space the prisoners themselves had been denied. The dissonance was profound. Inside the camps, life revolved around rituals of survival, morning roll calls under the brutal sun, work details digging ditches, hauling water, repairing roads, the afternoon heat, suffocating in barracks with no ventilation, the evening meal, never enough, the nights filled with the sounds of coughing, crying, whispered prayers. The women developed coping mechanisms. They formed committees to distribute food fairly. They organized medical teams from nurses among them who worked with almost no supplies. They created makeshift schools where children learned arithmetic on scraps of paper. They held secret church services and celebrated birthdays with songs instead of cake. But the psychological toll was constant. Depression spread like disease. Some women retreated inward, silent for days. Others became obsessively focused on small tasks, mending clothes with no thread, washing in water too filthy to clean. These were symptoms of minds trying to preserve sanity in an insane situation. Seeing Japanese women in positions of authority added another layer to this struggle. It was not just about envy or anger. It was about confronting the randomness of fate. Why were they prisoners while those women were free? The question had no answer, and that made it worse. What the prisoners could not see was the full reality of Japanese women's wartime experience. Many had been conscripted, not volunteered. Factory workers endured 12-hour shifts in dangerous conditions. Comfort women, a sanitized term for sexual slavery, suffered unspeakable horrors across occupied Asia. Even the uniformed women the prisoners observed often faced rigid hierarchies, limited advancement, and expectations that placed national duty above personal desire. But from behind barbed wire, none of that was visible. The prisoners saw only what appeared before them: women in clean uniforms, moving with purpose, teaching, commanding. The illusion was powerful, and illusions, in captivity, could be as painful as truth. Spring 1944, Jiden Camp, Batavia, Jakarta, Java. The war had entered its third year. The prisoners had learned to measure time differently, not in months or seasons, but in the spaces between meals, between roll calls, between moments of hope and despair. They had stopped talking about when the Allies would come. They focused only on surviving until tomorrow. In April, the camp commandant announced a new policy. Female prisoners would be marched to a nearby facility twice a week for re-education sessions. The term was deliberately vague. The women feared the worst. Interrogations, propaganda lectures, forced labor. The first march took place on a humid morning. Guards escorted around 50 women through the gates and down a dusty road lined with palm trees. They walked in silence, conserving energy, watching for any opportunity to steal food or smuggle information. After 20 minutes, they arrived at a compound surrounded by high fences. Inside, they could see a parade ground, administrative buildings, and rows of young Japanese and Indonesian recruits standing in formation. This was a training facility for auxiliary troops, local collaborators being drilled into service for the occupying forces. The women were ordered to sit on the ground at the edge of the parade ground. Guards stood behind them, rifles ready. The sun beat down, dust coated their skin. Then the session began. A Japanese officer stepped forward and barked commands. The recruits snapped to attention. They executed drills with mechanical precision, marching, turning, saluting. The prisoners watched, confused about why they had been brought here. Then a woman appeared. She wore a crisp khaki uniform with a belt, insignia, and polished boots. Her hair was tied back severely. She carried a wooden baton. She was perhaps 30 years old, her face stern, her movements precise. She walked to the front of the formation and began speaking in Japanese, her voice sharp and commanding. The recruits listened intently. She demonstrated hand signals. She corrected postures. She moved through the ranks, tapping shoulders, adjusting stances. She was not assisting the male officers. She was leading the session. The prisoners sat frozen. Some stared opally. Others looked down, as if refusing to acknowledge what they were seeing. A few whispered to each other, but guards quickly silenced them. One of the Australian nurses, a woman named Margaret, later wrote in her hidden diary that it felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. She had spent 2 years believing the enemy were barbarians who treated women as property. Yet here was a woman who commanded respect, who wielded authority, who taught men how to fight. Another prisoner, a British schoolteacher named Dorothy, felt a surge of anger, so intense it nauseated her. She had been forced about to male guards, to scrub floors, to beg for scraps of food. And this woman, this enemy woman, stood tall, clean, empowered. The session lasted an hour. When it ended, the prisoners were marched back to camp in silence. No one spoke of what they had seen. But that night, the barracks buzzed with whispered conversations that stretched until dawn. The forced marches to the training facility continued throughout the spring and into summer. Each session followed the same pattern. The prisoners sat in the dirt, the recruits drilled, and the Japanese women instructors moved through the formations with authority that could not be ignored. Over time, the prisoners began to notice details. There were at least 3 female instructors rotating through the sessions. One was older, perhaps in her 40s, with graying hair and a posture that suggested military experience. Another was younger, barely out of her teens, but she moved with confidence that belied her age. The third spoke multiple languages, Japanese, Malay, and broken English, and sometimes addressed the Indonesian recruits directly. The prisoners also noticed how the male officers deferred to these women in certain contexts. When the female instructors spoke, the recruits listened. When they corrected errors, no one questioned them. They were not assistants. They were educators, tacticians, figures of institutional authority. For some prisoners, repeated exposure dulled the shock. It became routine, just another humiliation in a long series of humiliations. But for others, the experience deepened into something more complex. A Dutch nurse named Cornelia admitted in a post-war interview that she had felt a flicker of something she was ashamed to name: envy. Not of the enemy, not of the ideology, but of the visible fact that these women had roles, had purpose, had agency in a world that had stripped agency from her completely. An American Red Cross worker named Helen wrote in a smuggled letter that the sight haunted her. She kept asking herself why she had been taught that women's strength lay in endurance and sacrifice, while the enemy seemed to believe women's strength could also be tactical, martial, visible. The climax of this psychological confrontation came in late June 1944. During one session, the youngest Japanese instructor noticed the prisoners watching and walked toward them. The guard stiffened, uncertain. She stopped a few meters away and stared directly at the women behind the wire. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the instructor spoke in accented, but clear English. "You think you are different," she said. "You think you fight for freedom. But you are here, and I am there." A guard shouted at her in Japanese. She turned and walked back to the parade ground without another word. The prisoners sat in stunned silence. One began to cry quietly. Another clenched her fists until her nails drew blood. The march back to camp that day felt longer than ever before. That night, Margaret wrote in her diary, "I do not know what I believe anymore. I know only that we are losing more than the war. We are losing the story we told ourselves about why we fight." The enemy was no longer abstract. The enemy had a face, a voice, a presence that could not be reduced to propaganda, and that realization was more devastating than hunger, more painful than disease. It was the collapse of certainty in a world that had already taken everything else the war ground on for another year. By mid-1945, the camps had become places of slow death. Food rations dropped to starvation levels. Diseases ravaged the barracks. Women died of malnutrition, dysentery, untreated infections. The survivors grew skeletal, their bodies consuming themselves to stay alive. The forced marches to the training facility stopped in early 1945. The Japanese military was retreating on all fronts. Resources were being diverted. The propaganda value of showing prisoners Japanese military organization no longer mattered. The women were left to rot in their camps, forgotten by their captors, invisible to the world. Then, in August, rumors began to spread. Whispers passed from barracks to barracks. Something had happened. A weapon. Cities destroyed. Japan was losing. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. For the prisoners, liberation did not come immediately. In some camps, guards simply disappeared overnight, leaving the women trapped behind wire with no food, no protection, and no idea what would happen next. In others, Allied forces arrived within days, British and Australian troops moving through Java and Sumatra, American forces landing in the Philippines. The liberation of Jideng camp came on September 8, 1945. British soldiers entered cautiously, unsure what they would find. What they discovered horrified them. Emaciated women staggering through filth, bodies stacked in makeshift morgues, children with distended bellies and hollow eyes. Medical teams moved in immediately. Emergency rations were distributed carefully. Too much food too quickly could kill. Field hospitals were established. The women were photographed for identification records. Many were unrecognizable from their pre-war images. Margaret, the Australian nurse who had kept the hidden diary, weighed 72 pounds when she was liberated. She had weighed 135 pounds when captured. Dorothy, the British schoolteacher, had lost all her teeth to scurvy. Cornelia, the Dutch nurse, could barely walk due to beriberi-induced nerve damage. The physical recovery would take months. The psychological recovery would take far longer. In the weeks after liberation, the women began to process what they had endured. Medical officers conducted interviews. Relief workers recorded testimonies. Photographers documented the camps. The world was finally seeing what had been hidden behind barbed wire for 3.5 years. But when the women spoke about their experiences, they rarely mentioned the Japanese female instructors. It was not the most traumatic part of their captivity. It was not the most physically traumatic. Yet for many, it remained one of the most psychologically disorienting memories. Margaret returned to Australia in late 1945. She tried to resume her nursing career but found herself unable to connect with the pre-war world. In a letter to a fellow survivor years later, she wrote, "No one wants to hear about the women we saw. They want to hear about suffering. They want to hear about heroism. They do not want to hear that the enemy was more complicated than we were told." Dorothy settled in England and never spoke publicly about her captivity. Her family found her diary after her death in 1987. In it, she had written, "I hated them. I hated her, but I also envied what she represented. A woman with purpose in a world that had stripped purpose from us. I do not know how to reconcile that feeling." Cornelia gave an interview to a Dutch newspaper in 1952. She mentioned the training sessions briefly. The reporter dismissed it as a minor detail and did not include it in the published article. The story did not fit the narrative of Japanese barbarism and allied righteousness. The broader public memory focused on atrocities: the Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the medical experiments, the massacres. These horrors were real and undeniable, but they overshadowed the more subtle, more complex experiences that did not fit neatly into the story of good versus evil. As for the Japanese women who had served as military instructors, most disappeared into post-war anonymity. Some were questioned during war crimes investigations, but were rarely charged. Their roles were considered auxiliary, non-combatant. The occupation authorities were more focused on prosecuting senior officers and those directly responsible for atrocities. The women who had stood on those parade grounds, who had taught recruits, who had embodied a different vision of gender and war, they returned to civilian life, married, raised families, and rarely spoke of their wartime service. In post-war Japan, women were expected to return to traditional roles. The brief era of militarized femininity was quietly erased. Decades later, historians began to uncover these hidden dimensions of the war. Interviews with elderly survivors, forgotten diaries, archived camp records. Slowly, the fuller picture emerged. The female POWs who had witnessed Japanese women in military roles were not imagining things. It had been real, and it had mattered, in ways that rippled through their lives long after the war ended. Wars are remembered in grand narratives, battles won and lost, empires rising and falling, heroes celebrated and villains condemned. But within those narratives are quieter stories, moments that do not fit neatly into the mythology we construct about conflict. The female prisoners who saw Japanese women teaching in military schools experienced something that challenged the very foundation of their understanding. They had been told they were fighting for a world that valued freedom, dignity, and the elevation of women, yet in captivity, stripped of agency and subjected to brutal deprivation. They witnessed enemy women occupying roles of authority and purpose that had been denied to them in their own societies. This was not a story of admiration for the enemy. It was a story of dissonance, of confronting uncomfortable truths about gender, power, and propaganda. The Japanese women they saw were not symbols of liberation. They too existed within a rigid, militaristic system that ultimately consumed millions of lives. But their visible presence shattered the simplistic narrative that the Allies alone represented progress. The experience left scars that outlasted the physical wounds of starvation and disease. It planted questions that survivors carried for the rest of their lives. What does freedom mean when it is conditional? What does empowerment look like when it serves oppression? And why, in a war fought for civilization, were women on both sides still forced to prove their worth within systems designed by men? History does not offer easy answers. It offers only the fragments of lived experience, the testimonies of those who endured, and the responsibility to remember all of it, not just the parts that confirm what we want to believe. The women who survived the camps returned to a world that wanted to celebrate their resilience but not examine their complexity. They had seen something that could not be unseen, and in that seeing, they carried a truth that remains uncomfortable even today. The enemy is never as simple as we need them to be, and neither are we.